Hello and welcome to the Talking Donkey. My name is Ryan and with me I have Seno.
G'day, mate. The world is full of bizarre and fantastical stories, tales that are unbelievable until you experience them. And the Bible's no different. As a book we know, as people who have been Christians for a while, if you're any student of the Bible, you know that the Bible is full of brutal, bamboozling and bizarre bits that are just, you don't know what to do with.
That's right. And here on the show we want to talk about those things and lean into the crazy a little bit.
Yep.
And so today we want to talk about the infamous story, Elisha and the she-bears.
Oh, yeah.
How about you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it's a cracker of a story. The reason we're talking about this story, mate, is that a few months ago I was watching the Joe Rogan Experience. Joe Rogan's podcast where he does those long-form interviews. It's immensely popular. Like, I think he's the most popular podcaster in the world.
Yeah.
And he had a guy on named Douglas Murray. And Douglas Murray's an Englishman who's fairly famous. He's an atheist, and so's Joe, apparently. I think he's not a believer in God of any kind. And they were having a bit of a chuckle about that, laughing at the ridiculousness of religious people and Christians in particular. And Douglas Murray brought up this story, the story of Elisha and the she-bears, so that they could have a good full-on laugh at Christians. And it is, the way they read it, hysterically funny.
Yeah.
And just fantastical and bizarre. And so we thought we'd tackle that one today and go, is it as bizarre as you think? What is this story actually like? Can we shed some light on this story of Elisha and the she-bears?
Sure. Well, how about we read it? It's not very long. The story comes from the book of 2 Kings, which is in the Old Testament. Let's go. It starts like this. So Elisha went up to Bethel. And as he was walking along the road, some youths came out of the town and jeered at him. "Go on up, you bald head," they said. "Go on up, you bald head." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I can understand it. I mean, they said it twice.
They said it twice. Right. Yeah. And you can see why Joe Rogan would love this as a bald man.
Oh, yeah.
He would go, "Oh, I have the power."
You have the power. You can understand why everyone reacts to that story, because what do you imagine? When you imagine children, you imagine these kindergarten kids playing on seesaws and merry-go-rounds and their play equipment, and they look, "Oh, mummy, look, there's a bald man." "Oh, look, baldy." And then all of a sudden a bear comes out and rips these kindergartners limb from limb and leaves their bloody bits lying around. And so I can understand why they picture it the way they do. It is absolutely brutal and bizarre as it stands, the story.
When we were reviewing this and researching it, we actually found a really funny YouTube clip. We won't show on the channel. We might link it in the description below.
Yep.
But I think that does a pretty good job on showing how brutal
and bizarre and funny. This is one of those classic stories where people who are not people of faith, they love to grab these sorts of bits of the Bible and use them to have a bit of a laugh. And you can totally understand why. I kind of laugh a little bit myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think whether you're Christian or not, like we tend to think of the Bible as a guide or something to something to learn from. And you read this and you go, what am I meant to walk away with?
Yeah.
Like, am I just I've made fun of people that have mullets? Am I not meant to do that?
No.
Am I going to get mauled by a bear at some point?
I think it's facial hair you got to be careful of. That's all right.
Okay, yeah, sure. But legitimately though, whether Christians and non-Christians, I think struggle with this, just to even understand what's happening.
Absolutely. And I think we can shed some light on it. I think there are things to be said that might make this story a little bit easier to understand, and hopefully point us in the right direction with other stories that we find fantastical and bizarre.
Yeah, and so I think, for me at least, and what I think other people, find weird or bamboozling or whatever it might be, I think there's a couple of things. One is the fact that children are being mauled by bears, and that it's happening because they called him bald.
They called him bald, yes. Those two things.
They don't seem to align in terms of, that's not the reaction you should have.
Yeah. So there are some setup things there.
Yeah.
So we need to talk about who these youths are.
Yes, that's the word that's used. Yes.
And we need to talk about the setup, what the scenario is. How would you picture it? Because I think this is the thing. We have a picture in our head. We read this little story, and we picture it in our minds. And so we need to talk. We need to actually reshape that picture in our minds to understand probably what is more likely to be going on. And that may help us to understand, yes, why he sews bears on them.
Yeah. So let's talk about the youth or the children thing, because the word the story doesn't use is children.
No.
It explicitly says youth.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't necessarily mean children.
No. It's actually more likely and more often used of young men.
Okay.
And so...
Like 18, 19-year-old.
Well, it could, anywhere from 15 to 19 is probably a ballpark kind of area. And young men is a different proposition entirely. When you've got a whole bunch of young men hanging around together, then you're in a different story, right? You're in a different movie. You're not walking past the kiddies' playground and watching kiddies play on play equipment. You're walking down a street and you're watching youths laying around together. So they're not occupied, they're not working. What are they doing? They're hanging out together. And what's the nature of a bunch of young men together like that? There's always a threat, particularly in movies when you see this. You know, when people tell stories, young men hanging around together is never a good look in a movie.
Yeah.
They're always up to no good.
That's when the tension starts rising.
That's right, and it usually ratchets up to violence. There's always an implied threat.
Yeah.
Whether the main character can defuse it or not, or whether it ends in violence is another thing, but there's always an implied threat of violence with these things in these stories. And I think we need to understand that with this group. Probably goes to how many of them are as well. So
yes, there were at minimum 42. Right?
Yes, and do you think in any reasonable estimation that if 42 died, there were only 43 or 44 there?
Probably not.
Probably not. Because what's that famous story? I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you.
Yeah.
And so I think it's much more likely that this was a significant group of young men. And so you imagine what a gang of 5 or 6 young blokes can do in terms of the implied threat to someone. And imagine that group 100, 150. What they can egg each other on to do, they're not far away of doing really dumb things and often really violent things. So there's often there's anger underneath with young men. So I think this is a very threatening group of young blokes.
Yeah, and that paints a totally different picture from like a bunch of little kids maybe sneering at him to a literal mob of young men making whether or not you think a bald head is a good or a bad threat is kind of doesn't really matter.
No,
it's the fact that they're saying it and what's implied behind what they're saying.
Well, often these scenarios start with an innocent thing, don't they? You know, they'll throw out a compliment or a mild insult. It's just nothing, but it's a precursor to standing up, strutting out there, putting yourself in the path. And so these words are freighted with violence, not because the words themselves are terrible, they're just silly words, right? But that's what you do, isn't it? You use silly words as a pretext to then do the next thing. And what normally happens is violence of some kind. And so in the way I read this story is I think that Elisha is in great danger here. This guy walking along the road is in incredible danger from these young men. And what's most likely to happen is once they've started, and they haven't just said it once, they've said it twice. And when that happens, you know, somebody says something once, you just kind of keep walking, just say nothing, keep your eyes down, don't look at them, and make eye contact. And it'll hopefully be okay. And if no one says anything else, but they said it twice, that tells you there's intent there, there's something, there's another dynamic going on. And I think most likely what's going to happen is if nothing else happens, Elisha is going to be, he's up for some trouble. Most likely he's going to be hurt and probably die, I think. Like, I don't think we appreciate the threat that's here from this group of young men to an innocent person walking along the road. And you've got to think they know who he is. I guess we're going to get to his identity in a minute, but
sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Elisha's reaction then, because his response is to curse, and so at least
he's going to cuss him out.
Yeah. He's just going to throw a couple of swear words their way. Well, let's talk about that then. So, what a curse is not a swear word. A curse is
a bad word.
A bad word.
A curse is a word against someone. You know, may your hair disappear. May you go bald.
Go to hell.
Go to hell. It's an implied wish for a state of affairs, something to happen to that other person.
Yeah, I hope this bad thing happens to you.
Yeah. And so the power of a curse is the power of a person to bring that state of affairs about. So do they have the ability to do that themselves, or the ability to have this happen themselves? That's the power of either blessing, a good word, or a curse, a bad word. And so that there's a question there about Elisha. What power does he have to bring this curse into effect? But you can understand why he's saying it, because he's already under threat. And the question there is about, well, who he is and who they are, because they've got to know who he is. Yep. That's the other thing that's going on here. This guy's not some random bloke walking down the street with his girlfriend getting threatened by some hoodlums on the side of the road. This guy is known to everyone. He's world famous. Like, this guy is famous in the entire place where he lives. He's a rock star. He spent the last couple of years hanging around with the most famous guy in the nation, and he's now become the most famous guy in the nation because that guy's disappeared. He's out of the picture. And so you've got to think these young guys know who he is, and that changes things as well. So they're not just threatening any old somebody. They're not just threatening some random person walking along the road. They're threatening him because they know him. And what do they know about him?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. And what they assume, what they know, what they think is that Elisha proclaims to be a prophet of God, which pretty much just means that he speaks on behalf of God. He comes and tells people what God either wants or desires or what they need to hear.
Yeah, he's claiming to be God's voice.
And so if they're saying, if they're jeering at him, if they're making fun of him, they're making a big statement, I think.
Well, one of two things, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're either saying, you and the God you came in with, right? They're either actually having a go at God himself, or they're saying, you aren't who you think you are.
Yeah.
Right? So you claim to be this jumped up prophet guy, but you're nothing. And we'll show you nothing, because we're going to beat you down.
Yeah. And for me, it's interesting because this story then becomes about whose words are more powerful.
Yeah.
It's a weird.
Go up their bald head.
Yeah. It's a weird way to look at this story, a way that don't think I've really appreciated before. It's a story of who has more power, whose words or voice has.
Does God listen to?
Yeah. And so that comes to I think, at least for me, makes sense of the bears scenario.
Yeah. And so you notice Elisha's not in control there. He doesn't call the bears out. He curses them. He does what he can do. So we all know what they can do as a group. They can beat him bloody and probably to death. What can he do? He can say this. He can say this thing. But he's really got no other power. It's not as if he's got a machine gun there he can pull out and threaten them with. He's got nothing else other than his words. And so, we see what impact they have.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think for me, this story is about, what I want to try to accomplish is maybe just suggest or show or go, maybe this story actually has more to it than what originally meets the eye. It's not just about kids getting mauled to death because some guy's really sensitive about his hair, but there's actually maybe there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
Maybe there might be something worth looking into.
No, I think you're right. I think that one of the things I think we've shown is that there's more to this story when you actually take a proper look at it. I think as well, though, if there's a moral about anything here, it's that I don't care. Joe and Douglas can laugh all they want. You're free. You're welcome to laugh at the Christian
we can
faith.
laugh at it.
There's plenty of laughable things about being Christian, and we know them probably better than most. And so you're free to laugh. But I think if you're going to read these stories, you actually need to read these stories in their own, from their own perspective. You need to, if you're going to read these stories charitably, and that's true of anyone, right? If anyone tells you a story of some kind that you find a bit fantastical, you need to at least begin to understand it from their perspective or from what's going on for them. That I think that makes sense, and I think that's a general principle in life. And I think it's true as well of reading other people's texts. And so if you're going to read the Quran or the Bible or whatever book and make judgments about it, you at least want to actually try and understand it on its own terms before you then laugh. And then laugh all you want.
Yeah. No, I agree. You want to see what they're actually trying to say.
Yeah.
And not misinterpret or anything like that.
Yeah.
But if you guys have got your own bamboozling, brutal, bizarre Bible bit, let us know in the comments and we might have a crack at it. We'll see you next time.